Most people, when they imagine a zombie apocalypse, picture the first week. The chaos, the running, the desperate choices made in parking lots and grocery store aisles. That image is vivid and almost universally shared. But here is what almost no one thinks about. What does the world look like 10 years later? Not the catastrophe itself, but the long, quiet aftermath. The part that is, in many ways, stranger than the collapse. Let's start with a number. After a civilizational disruption of this magnitude, the global population would likely stabilize somewhere between 400 million and 1.2 billion people. That wide range is intentional, because what happens in year 10 depends almost entirely on what happened in years 2, 3, and 4. And those years are rarely discussed. In year 1, most people survive on what already exists: canned food, bottled water, generator fuel, the physical stockpiles of a civilization that had been producing at massive industrial scale. For a small population spread across a landscape emptied of most of its former density, those resources stretch surprisingly far. At first, this seems reassuring, and for the first several months, it genuinely is. But zoom out for a moment. Most commercially canned food carries a shelf life of 2 to 5 years under ideal conditions. The vast majority of food in warehouses was not stored under ideal conditions before the collapse, and certainly not after. By year 3, the loss rate accelerates. By year 5, the canned food era is effectively over. What remains is either genuinely shelf-stable or has been replaced by what survivors managed to grow themselves. This transition from scavenging to producing is the most consequential event of the entire post-collapse decade. And it is not smooth. It is rough, uneven, and frequently fatal. Most modern adults have never farmed. Not really. The real challenge is not knowing what to plant. It is knowing when. It is understanding the microclimate of the land you occupy. It is recognizing plant disease before it spreads. It is managing soil depletion across seasons. None of this knowledge is instinctive, and it takes years to acquire even under ideal teaching conditions. The most valuable person in year 2 is not a soldier. It is a 70-year-old woman who grew up on a working farm and knows how to manage a root cellar. The collapse of industrial food systems does not simply force people to grow their own food. It creates a brutal filter based on proximity to pre-industrial knowledge. Communities near that knowledge survive the agricultural transition with something approaching competence. Communities without it lose people to crop failure, malnutrition, and the diseases that follow. The map of year 10 settlements is not random. It traces older patterns, river valleys, traditional farming regions, places where the land was cultivated long before industrial agriculture took over. Now consider water. Urban systems were designed to be maintained. Pumps require power. Filtration requires chemical inputs. Without active maintenance, urban water systems fail progressively, becoming unreliable within weeks and non-functional within months. Open water sources near cities carry decades of chemical contamination that does not disappear simply because the civilization that created it has stopped adding to the load. The groups that flourish by year 10 establish themselves early near sources that were historically clean. High elevation streams, deep artesian wells, rivers far upstream from industrial centers. Zoom out and look at sanitation as a system. Modern urban sanitation nearly eliminated cholera, typhoid, and a dozen other waterborne diseases that killed millions annually for centuries. The moment that infrastructure fails, that protection evaporates, not slowly, quickly. Within a year, waterborne disease becomes one of the leading causes of death among survivor populations. Most people imagine the zombie threat remains the dominant killer throughout the first decade. This is almost certainly wrong. By year 5, disease, malnutrition, and interpersonal conflict have surpassed the original threat as causes of death. The original event is not the primary killer of the decade. It is the trigger that removes the protective systems that were quietly keeping everyone alive. Medicine makes this gap particularly stark. The primary medical reality of a post-collapse decade is not dramatic trauma surgery. It is the return of ordinary chronic illness as a death sentence. A person with type 1 diabetes managed their condition with insulin. A person with a simple bacterial infection took a 5-day course of antibiotics. These interventions were so routine that most people never thought of them as life-saving. They were. By year 3, those supplies are gone. This creates a slow, quiet culling of the survivor population based on pre-existing medical conditions. The people who remain by year 10 are, on average, younger and constitutionally more robust. Not by design, by attrition. Let us consider fuel. Untreated gasoline begins to degrade within 3 to 6 months. Diesel lasts somewhat longer with stabilizing additives, but without active refining and distribution infrastructure. The liquid fuel that powers the pre-collapse world becomes chemically unstable within a year or two. By year 3, the era of routine automotive mobility is over for most survivor groups, and this is a consequence far beyond personal convenience. Modern civilization was organized around the assumption of cheap, easy transportation. Remove it, and every community is forced to become self-sufficient within the radius of what can be moved by human or animal power. That radius is much smaller than most people feel. By year 10, the geography of settlement is reorganizing itself according to the ancient physics of movement that cheap fossil fuel had temporarily suspended. The political map of year 10 does not look like the pre-collapse map with some names changed. It looks like a completely different kind of political organization. The nation-state as a governing structure requires the ability to project authority across distance. That requires communication and military logistics. Both require fuel and infrastructure that no longer exist at scale. What emerges instead resembles the structure of early medieval city-states, more than anything from the modern era. Not because of ideology, because of physics and logistics. Communication specifically is one of the most underestimated system dependencies. The internet fails within days of disruption. Cellular networks go dark within weeks. By year 2, the primary form of long-distance communication is the same as in the 17th century. A person carrying a message on foot, by horse, or by boat. The information horizon of a typical survivor community contracts dramatically. News from 50 kilometers away takes days. News from 500 kilometers is practically mythological. The world beyond direct travel range becomes, in experiential terms, almost as remote as another continent felt to a medieval European peasant. The long-term exception is radio. Shortwave radio is relatively simple to build from salvaged components, operates over enormous distances with modest power, and was used as the backbone of global communication before satellites. By year 10, communities with shortwave capability hold a communication advantage that translates directly into political and economic influence. The emergence of a new information infrastructure looks, in many respects, like the early radio era of the 1920s. Sparse, inconsistent, enormously consequential for those who can access it, Education sits at the foundation of everything else. In years 1 and 2, formal education effectively stops in most communities. Adults are entirely consumed by immediate survival. Children are conscripted into labor roles. By year 10, the children who were 5 to 10 years old at the time of collapse are now teenagers who've spent their entire formative learning years without formal instruction. A significant fraction of the post-collapse generation lacks basic literacy. And because literacy is the foundation of almost all knowledge transmission, the divergence between communities that maintained it and those that did not begins compounding in ways that look, over time, less like a temporary gap and more like a structural difference in civilizational capacity. Now zoom out and consider the global variation. The world in year 10 is not uniformly devastated. It is a mosaic of extremely varied outcomes driven by mundane background conditions. Population density, climate, agricultural potential, access to clean water, pre-existing levels of rural self-sufficiency. Regions with low population density, warm climates, and strong traditions of subsistence agriculture fare dramatically better than dense urban regions with industrial economies and high medication dependency. Some of the regions considered least developed by pre-collapse economic metrics are, in year 10, among the most stable, because they were never as dependent on the industrial systems that failed. Meanwhile, the most developed regions have the hardest decade. Their entire civilization was built on layers of interdependent complexity that collapse catastrophically when the bottom layers fail. A skyscraper is an extraordinary achievement. It is also completely uninhabitable without electricity, water pressure, and functioning elevators. In year 1, the most advanced infrastructure in the world is not an asset. It is a liability. The governance of year 10 communities also defies the dominant narrative. Most scenarios picture either anarchy or warlordism. And while coercive power is real in the first years, it is not the dominant pattern of year 10. A community organized purely around coercion wastes enormous energy on enforcement, drives away the skilled, and is terrible at the complex coordination that agricultural life requires. The communities that survive as functional entities tend to be those that aligned authority with competence, not democracy in any formal sense, but the practical recognition that if the person making decisions about planting schedules does not actually know about planting, people will stop following their instructions. Legitimacy, even in a post-collapse world, turns out to be a practical necessity rather than a philosophical luxury. By year 10, the map of human settlement shows a pattern of nodes and peripheries. The nodes are communities that have established functional food production, clean water, basic governance, knowledge preservation, and trade with neighbors. They are not thriving by any pre-collapse standard, but they are stable, they are reproducing. The periphery is everything else. And the distance between nodes and periphery is actively growing as nodes accumulate advantages that compound over time. Daily life in a functional year. 10 community is not dramatic. Morning begins before dawn. Cooking over wood or charcoal, the diet is nutritionally adequate but monotonous. Dried grain, preserved legumes, occasional eggs. Most adults split their time between food production and some specialized role. The idea of a purely non-productive social role is essentially impossible. There is not enough surplus to support it. Even the community's closest equivalent to a political leader spends significant time in physical labor. At first, this seems like a grim picture. And the physical demands and limited material comfort are genuinely difficult by pre-collapse standards. But it contains something that pre-collapse surveys of well-being identified as surprisingly rare in modern life: a direct connection between effort and visible outcome. In year 10, if you plant and tend and harvest well, you eat. If the water system is maintained, people stay healthy. Whether this constitutes well-being in a meaningful sense is not simple, but it is a different relationship to agency and consequence than most pre-collapse adults ever experienced. The final thing worth considering is memory. The survivors remember the old world, some with acute grief, others with something more complicated. But the children of year 10, those born after the collapse or too young to have adult memories of it, do not remember it the same way. For them, the pre-collapse world is a story, a mythology, full of unimaginable abundance, unimaginable complexity, and catastrophic fragility. What these children build will be shaped by how honestly the old world is remembered. Communities that remember its failure modes, its dependence on fragile systems, its ecological costs, have a chance to build something more durable. Communities that remember only the abundance and seek to recreate it without understanding why it failed will likely repeat aspects of that failure at a smaller scale. This is not a moral lesson, it is a systems observation. 10 years is a long time in a human life. It is a very short time in the life of a civilization. What we are looking at in year 10 is not a recovered world. It is not a lost world. It is a world in the process of becoming. The patterns being laid down now in agriculture, governance, knowledge, transmission, and trade are the foundations of whatever comes next. Whether they lead to something worth having is not determined yet. It is being determined. One community at a time, one season at a time, one generation at a time. That, perhaps more than anything else, is what 10 years after looks like. Not a wasteland, not a triumph, a world quietly and seriously deciding what it wants to become. And yet, even in year 10, something unexpected keeps appearing across communities that have no contact with each other. In different climates, different languages, different geographies, people are writing things down, not because anyone told them to, not because there is a system requiring it, but because the survivors who lived through the collapse understand at a level that requires no explanation that knowledge left only in human memory is fragile. A person dies and everything they knew dies with them. A book survives a generation. A printed page stored carefully survives several. The impulse to record, to preserve, to leave something behind for whoever comes next is one of the most consistent behaviors observed in stable year 10 communities. It is quiet, it is unglamorous, and it may be the single most important thing happening in this decade. Trade routes are also re-emerging, and their shape is telling. They follow rivers, they follow coastlines, they follow the same geographic logic that shaped the very first human trade networks thousands of years ago. A community on a navigable river has access to neighbors in both directions at relatively low cost. A coastal settlement can move goods by boat far more efficiently than anything land-based. The communities positioned on these natural corridors are becoming slowly regional hubs. Not cities yet, not even towns in the pre-collapse sense, but places where people from different settlements meet regularly, exchange goods, share information, and occasionally intermarry. These intersections are, historically, where complexity begins to grow again, where specialization becomes viable, where the first tentative institutions beyond the single community start to form. There is also something worth noting about how people in year 10 relate to the landscape itself. The pre-collapse generation largely experience the natural world as background. Something visible from windows, something visited on weekends, something managed by systems so large and invisible that most people never thought about them. In year 10, the landscape is the primary text of daily life. The angle of sunlight tells you what to plant and when. The behavior of insects tells you about crop health. The color of stream water tells you about conditions upstream. Cloud formations matter, wind direction matters. The position of the moon matters for certain agricultural and fishing decisions in ways that most pre-collapse adults would have dismissed as superstition. This re-engagement with the physical world is not romantic. It is operational. But it is also a form of literacy that the pre-collapse world had almost entirely lost. And that year, 10 is quietly rebuilding from necessity. None of this is fast. None of it is certain. Communities fail. Harvests fail. Leaders fail. Some of the most promising nodes of year 10 stability will be gone by year 15, lost to drought or disease or conflict, or simply the accumulated weight of too many hard seasons in a row. The arc of recovery, if recovery is even the right word for what is happening, is not a line. It is a jagged and uncertain path through terrain that has never been mapped, because no civilization has ever had to find its way back from exactly this kind of collapse before. What lies ahead is genuinely unknown, and that uncertainty is not a comfortable thing to sit with. But here is what 10 years of observation, of tracing cause and effect through the wreckage and the rebuilding ultimately suggests. Civilizations are not buildings. They are not structures that stand or fall in a single moment. They are processes, living, adaptive, deeply human, processes that persist as long as people persist, and that begin reorganizing themselves the moment the acute crisis allows for anything beyond immediate survival. The world of year 10 is not the world that was lost. It will never be that world again. But it is a world that is undeniably still in the business of becoming something. And that, in the full sweep of what this decade has cost, is not a small thing. That is where we leave this. Not with answers, because the honest answer is that year 10 has more open questions than closed ones, but with a clearer picture of what those questions actually are, not the dramatic ones that fill the imagination in the first weeks of a scenario like this. The quiet, structural, deeply human questions about how knowledge survives, how authority earns its legitimacy, how communities decide who belongs, and how a species that built something as extraordinary and as fragile as modern civilization chooses to remember what it learned. Thank you for watching. Take care of the things that keep you and the people around you alive. And pay attention to the 70-year-old in the room who knows how to grow food.